Imagine waking up tomorrow and your country's oil supply has been cut off overnight. The gas station near your house has a line stretching 4 blocks. Your stock portfolio has dropped 30% in 48 hours. And somewhere in the Persian Gulf, the most important waterway on planet Earth has just been blocked by a nation that has nothing left to lose. This is not a hypothetical. This is what is happening right now. And buried inside all of this chaos is one decision made by one man in Riyadh that will permanently reshape who controls the Middle East, who protects it, and who profits from it. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Saudi Arabia just pulled off the most calculated geopolitical move of the 21st century, and why the United States may never recover its position in this region again. But before we get there, we need to go back to where this all began, because nothing that is happening right now was accidental. Every explosion, every missile, every economic shockwave was set in motion years ago, and the world is only now waking up to the consequences. For decades, the Middle East ran on a simple, unspoken contract. The Gulf states, led by Saudi Arabia, would pump oil and keep prices stable. In return, the United States would park its warships in the region, maintain military bases from Bahrain to Qatar to Kuwait, and act as the ultimate security guarantor. If anyone threatened the Gulf, America would answer. That was the deal. It was never written down anywhere. It did not need to be. American aircraft carriers spoke louder than any treaty ever could. But that deal has been quietly falling apart for years, and the Iran crisis did not break it. It simply made the cracks impossible to ignore. When the current wave of Iranian aggression began escalating, the Gulf states watched something deeply unsettling unfold. The United States, consumed by its own political divisions, economic anxieties, and shifting foreign policy priorities, responded in ways that were slower, more hesitant, and more conditional than anyone in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi had expected. The protection that was supposed to be automatic suddenly felt negotiable. He was architecting a $142 billion security framework that does not depend on Washington's mood. You need to understand the specific nature of what Iran has been doing to the Gulf over the past several weeks. Because the threat is not just military. It is existential in an economic sense. Iran launched what analysts are now calling a multi-domain pressure campaign against Gulf infrastructure. This was not random. It was surgical, targeted, and designed to send a very specific message to every Gulf ruler simultaneously. The message was simple. Your economic survival is in our hands, not America's, ours. The strikes on Kuwait's Mina al-Ahmadi refinery were the opening act. This facility processes over 730,000 barrels of oil per day. When Iranian drones reached it in 2 coordinated waves, the fires that broke out were visible from space. But the physical damage, as severe as it was almost secondary to the psychological impact. Iran had just demonstrated that it could reach the beating heart of Gulf energy infrastructure and that American bases scattered across the region had not stopped it. Then came Saudi Arabia. Ballistic missiles tracked toward Riyadh, 3 of them. Saudi air defenses intercepted 1, 2 others landed in uninhabited areas. Simultaneously, 6 drones were intercepted over the eastern province, the region that happens to contain the majority of Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. This was not a coincidence. Iran was drawing a map for MBS, a map that showed exactly how vulnerable his kingdom truly was. Then came the most psychologically devastating move of all. Iranian strikes began targeting areas near Dimona in Israel, the location of Israel's primary nuclear research facility. For the first time in the history of this conflict, a nation had deliberately targeted a nuclear-adjacent site. The world held its breath. The implications were staggering. If Israel's nuclear infrastructure was no longer off-limits in Iranian strategic thinking, then every assumption about the rules of engagement in this war had just been thrown out the window. And through all of this, oil prices were doing something terrifying. Brent crude had surged past $114 per barrel. Analysts were already warning of $150 oil by summer. The International Energy Agency released a statement calling this the most severe energy supply crisis since the 1970s. Airline stocks were collapsing. Shipping insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf had quadrupled in a matter of weeks. Global inflation, which major economies had spent 2 years fighting, was threatening to surge back with a vengeance. This is the environment in which MBS made his move. And to understand the full genius and the full danger of what he did, you need to understand the one thing that was never supposed to happen. China was always the silent variable in Middle Eastern geopolitics. For years, the United States maintained its dominant position in the Gulf partly through military presence and partly through a simple financial reality. Gulf oil was priced in dollars. The petrodollar system meant that every barrel of oil sold anywhere in the world flowed through American financial infrastructure in some way. China could buy Saudi oil, but the transaction itself reinforced American financial supremacy. Beijing knew this, Washington knew this, and both sides spent years maneuvering around this uncomfortable truth. What MBS just announced is the most direct challenge to this architecture that has ever come from a Gulf state. The $142 billion security and investment framework he unveiled does something that no Saudi leader has ever done publicly before. It acknowledges that American security guarantees are conditional and that Saudi Arabia needs a parallel system that operates independently of Washington's political calendar. The framework has 3 layers, and each layer is more consequential than the last. The first layer is defensive technology. Saudi Arabia is investing massively in next-generation air and missile defense systems, drone interception technology, and early warning infrastructure. Critically, these systems are being sourced from multiple suppliers, not just American defense contractors, European systems, South Korean technology, and in certain categories that Washington would find deeply uncomfortable, Chinese-developed components are all part of the package. This is Saudi Arabia saying, clearly and publicly, that it will no longer accept technology dependency on a single supplier whose political winds can shift overnight. The second layer is economic architecture. The $142 billion is not just a defense budget. It is a restructuring of how Saudi Arabia integrates with global financial systems. New investment corridors are being established with Asian economies. Payment mechanisms that operate outside of SWIFT, the Western-dominated financial messaging system, are being quietly developed. Saudi Aramco is negotiating long-term supply contracts with Chinese and Indian buyers that include non-dollar settlement options. The petrodollar, that fundamental pillar of American global financial power, is being systematically undermined not by a hostile power but by America's own most important Middle Eastern ally. The third layer is the most dangerous one from Washington's perspective. It is the strategic ambiguity layer. MBS has structured this framework in a way that deliberately avoids forcing Saudi Arabia into either the American or Chinese camp. This is not accidental. It is the lesson of the Ukraine conflict applied to Middle Eastern strategy. Nations that were too deeply integrated into one great power system found themselves trapped when that great power's interests diverged from their own. Saudi Arabia is building a security architecture that allows it to play both sides simultaneously, buying American weapons when politically convenient, sourcing Chinese technology when economically efficient, and maintaining just enough ambiguity to prevent either superpower from taking Riyadh for granted. Now here is where this story gets truly remarkable, because the timing of this announcement was not random. MBS made this move in the middle of an active Iranian military campaign against Gulf infrastructure. He did it while Iranian drones were still in the air over Kuwait. He did it while Saudi air defenses were still on high alert. He did it at the exact moment when everyone expected Saudi Arabia to be running toward Washington for protection. Instead, he ran toward independence. And the message that sent to every capital on earth was seismic. If Saudi Arabia, the anchor of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the world's largest oil exporter and America's most strategically important Arab partner, is publicly diversifying away from American protection, then the entire security architecture of the Middle East is being rebuilt from scratch in real time. The Gulf states did not miss this signal. Within 72 hours of MBS's announcement, the UAE's foreign ministry made a statement that would have been unthinkable just 2 years ago. A senior Emirati official publicly criticized larger Arab and Islamic nations for failing to support the Gulf during the crisis, but in the same statement carefully avoided committing to any specific American-led security framework going forward. The UAE, which hosts the largest American military base in the region, was telegraphing that it too is watching the exits. But now we need to talk about the thing that could make all of this completely irrelevant. The thing that keeps energy ministers, central bank governors, and military planners awake at 3 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. Roughly 17 million barrels of crude oil transit the strait every 24 hours. There is no alternative. There is no pipeline large enough to replace it. There is no other route that is economically viable at scale. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. It is the circulatory system of the global economy. And Iran has threatened to close it. This is not the first time Iran has made this threat, but it has never made it under these specific conditions. Iran has never been under this level of military pressure from this many directions simultaneously. Iran has never had its own nuclear-adjacent sites targeted before. And Iran has never been in a situation where its leadership was calculating openly and publicly whether the cost of losing this conflict conventionally was greater than the cost of triggering a global economic catastrophe through Hormuz closure. What makes this threat different is what Iran said it would target if the closure was challenged. Iranian military officials, speaking through state media, indicated that any American naval attempt to keep the strait open by force would be met with strikes on regional infrastructure, meaning oil terminals, desalination plants, and financial centers across the Gulf. They specifically mentioned that power plants, the very targets that Trump's 5-day pause was designed to pause strikes on, would become legitimate targets for Iranian retaliation. Let us pause here and understand what a Hormuz closure actually means for the global economy, because the numbers are almost incomprehensible in their scale. If the strait closes for even 72 hours, global oil markets would enter a state of emergency pricing. Brent crude would likely surge past $180 per barrel within the first 24 hours of closure. The United States, despite its domestic shale production, would see gasoline prices double in approximately 3 weeks because of how integrated American refinery systems are with global crude pricing. Europe, which has been struggling with energy costs since the Russia-Ukraine conflict began, would face a crisis that could bring down multiple governments. China, which imports over 70% of the oil it uses and sources a substantial portion from the Gulf, would face an economic shock that could derail its entire growth trajectory. The shipping insurance market, already under extreme stress, would essentially cease to function for Gulf transiting vessels. The cost of moving a supertanker through the region would become so astronomically expensive that smaller shipping companies would simply stop operating entirely. Global supply chains, already fragile from years of pandemic disruption and geopolitical friction, would begin to fracture along their weakest points. Stock markets globally have already begun pricing in this risk. The S&P 500 has seen its highest volatility reading since 2020. European bourses have seen selling pressure not witnessed since the early days of the Ukraine conflict. Asian markets, particularly in South Korea and Japan, both of which are entirely dependent on Gulf energy imports, have seen their currency and equity markets move in ways that suggest serious institutional concern about a prolonged disruption. And here's the detail that almost nobody is talking about. The global strategic petroleum reserve system, the emergency stockpiles that governments maintain precisely for crises like this, was partially drawn down during previous energy shocks and has not been fully replenished in most major economies. The buffer that the world thought it had is thinner than it appears. A sustained Hormuz closure would exhaust strategic reserves in most major importing nations within approximately 3 months, and there is currently no clear mechanism for what happens after that. This is the economic abyss that the world is staring into, and it explains everything about why MBS's $142 billion move was so perfectly timed and so strategically brilliant. By establishing his new security architecture at precisely the moment when the American protection model was visibly failing to prevent Iranian attacks on Gulf soil, MBS accomplished something remarkable. He shifted the psychological framing of the entire crisis. He changed the question from, will America protect us, to, how do we protect ourselves regardless of what America does? That is a fundamentally different strategic posture. And it has profound implications for every decision that gets made in this conflict going forward. Consider the position it puts Washington in. The United States now faces a situation where its most important Gulf partner is publicly diversifying away from American dependency at the exact moment when America is trying to manage one of the most complex military situations in its recent history. If Washington responds too aggressively to the MBS framework, it risks accelerating Saudi Arabia's pivot toward China. If it says nothing, it signals that American strategic influence in the Gulf can be eroded without consequence. There is no clean answer. Now consider the position it puts Iran in. Tehran has spent decades calculating that Gulf states would never move too far from American protection because the alternative, accommodation with China or genuine independence, was seen as impossible. The MBS framework just demonstrated that the impossible is now underway. Iran's entire strategic theory of the Gulf has just been challenged at its foundation. And consider what it means for China. Beijing has been playing a long, patient game in the Middle East for over a decade, building economic relationships, avoiding military commitments, letting American overextension do the strategic work of reducing Washington's influence without China having to fire a single shot. The MBS framework does not put China in charge of Gulf security. It invites China to be a participant in a multipolar security architecture where no single power is dominant. That is actually better for Beijing than the alternative. It gets strategic access without strategic responsibility, which is precisely the kind of arrangement China's foreign policy has always sought. And now we reach the part of this story that connects everything together, because here is the question that the $142 billion framework raises but does not answer. Can it work? Can Saudi Arabia actually build an independent security architecture that functions in the middle of an active Iranian military campaign? Can technology and investment substitute for the kind of deep, integrated security relationship that takes decades to build? And most importantly, can MBS navigate the extraordinary political pressures he is now facing from multiple directions simultaneously without making a catastrophic miscalculation? Let us deal with the Iranian threat first, because it is the most immediate. Iran's military capabilities, despite weeks of sustained operations, have not been neutralized. Iranian analysts and Western intelligence assessments both suggest that while Iran has expended significant quantities of ballistic missiles and drones, it retains the ability to continue pressure operations for an extended period. The $1,000 drones that Iran produces domestically are cheap enough to be deployed in effectively unlimited numbers relative to the cost of intercepting them with expensive American-made missile defense systems. Every Iranian drone that forces a Patriot intercept represents a significant cost imbalance in Tehran's favor. This asymmetric economics of the conflict is something that MBS's new framework attempts to address directly. By investing in indigenous drone interception systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and directed energy weapons still in development, Saudi Arabia is trying to change the cost calculus of the Iranian pressure campaign. If intercepting an Iranian drone costs $10,000 instead of $200,000, the economics of the entire conflict shift dramatically. But the technology takes time, and Iran is operating now. This is the gap that the framework cannot immediately close. Saudi Arabia can announce a new security architecture. It can commit $142 billion. It can diversify its supplier relationships and build strategic ambiguity. But none of that prevents an Iranian ballistic missile from being launched toward Riyadh tonight. The gap between strategic announcement and operational capability is where the real danger lives. And here is what makes the next 60 to 90 days so critical. The decisions made in this window by Tehran, by Washington, by Riyadh, and by Beijing will determine whether this conflict finds a negotiated pause or escalates to a level that genuinely threatens the global economic system in ways from which recovery would take years. Trump's 5-day pause on strikes against Iranian power plants was the first signal that Washington is looking for an off-ramp. But Iran's public rejection of any dialogue simultaneously with that pause tells a different story. Tehran's internal political dynamics, where any accommodation with Washington is seen as strategic surrender by powerful hardline factions, make negotiation extremely difficult, even when both sides might theoretically want one. The most dangerous scenario, and the one that serious analysts are now gaming out in research centers and government offices from Washington to Beijing, is a partial Hormuz closure. Not a full blockade, which would trigger immediate American military response, but a series of Iranian actions: mining, harassment of tankers, targeting of terminal infrastructure that effectively makes the insurance and logistics of Gulf oil transit so expensive and so uncertain that the market responds as if the strait were closed even while it technically remains open. This scenario, sometimes called the gray zone closure, would create maximum economic damage while making it extremely difficult for the United States to point to a single clear act of war that justifies a decisive military response. It would spike oil prices catastrophically while keeping Iran technically below the threshold of an action that triggers automatic American military retaliation. And it would test the MBS framework at exactly the moment when that framework is most incomplete. If this gray zone scenario unfolds, the $142 billion announcement will face its first real test. Will Gulf states hold together? Will the new non-American security architecture begin functioning quickly enough to provide meaningful protection? Will China, now partially invested in Gulf stability through its economic relationships, apply pressure on Iran to pull back? Or will the entire new framework, announced with great fanfare, prove to be exactly what American officials have privately suggested, a negotiating posture rather than a functioning security system? The answer to those questions will define the Middle East for the next generation, not the missile exchanges, not even the oil price spikes. The structural question of whether the American security umbrella in the Gulf can be replaced, partially replaced, or whether it is simply irreplaceable will determine the shape of global power for decades. Here is what we know for certain. The world you understood before this conflict began no longer exists. The assumptions that governed global energy markets, Middle Eastern geopolitics, and American strategic dominance in the Gulf have all been called into question simultaneously. That does not mean they have been destroyed, but it means they must be renegotiated. And the renegotiation is happening right now, in real time, at extraordinary speed, with extraordinary stakes. MBS has placed his bet: $142 billion on independence, on strategic ambiguity, on the idea that Saudi Arabia can survive in a multipolar world without choosing a side. It is the most audacious strategic gamble in the kingdom's modern history. Whether it pays off or whether it accelerates a regional collapse will depend on decisions made in the next few months. And those decisions, in Tehran, in Washington, in Beijing, and in Riyadh, will either produce the most consequential geopolitical realignment since the end of the Cold War, or they will produce a catastrophe that makes every previous Middle Eastern crisis look manageable by comparison. The world is watching. The markets are pricing in the fear. The governments are calculating their options. And somewhere in all of this, buried beneath the missile trajectories and the oil price tickers and the diplomatic statements, is the simple, terrifying reality that the systems we all depend on for energy, for economic stability, for the basic functioning of global trade, are more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. The next move belongs to Tehran. And what Iran does next, whether it chooses the gray zone strategy, whether it accepts a pause, whether it escalates toward a red line that forces a decisive American response, will be the chapter of this story that we are all about to live through. Stay informed. The stakes have never been higher, and the story is far from over.